On the last quiet day before Pearl Harbor, the danger was already visible, but not yet clear. By early December 1941, American commanders in Hawaii were not living in a world of innocence. They knew the Pacific was tense. They knew Japan and the United States had moved close to war. They knew Washington had sent warnings in late November, including a naval message to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel that began with the blunt phrase that it was a war warning. They knew that conflict might come soon somewhere across the wide Pacific. What they did not have was a confirmed warning that the blow would fall at Pearl Harbor. That contradiction sits at the center of the story. The attack was a surprise, but not because there had been no warnings at all. It was a surprise because the warnings came in fragments, because they pointed in several directions at once, and because the most decisive pieces of information did not arrive, or were not understood, in time to change the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Oahu, in those final hours, was both an island home and an armed outpost. Its beaches, mountains, roads, airfields, and harbor formed the forward American base in the Central Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, the United States Pacific Fleet lay inside one of the most important naval anchorages in the world. Since April 1940, the fleet had been stationed there, far from the continental United States and close enough to Asia to carry strategic meaning. Its presence was meant to deter. It was also, by its very existence, a symbol. Symbols can become targets. The harbor itself was a complicated military landscape. Ford Island stood in the middle of the anchorage. Battleships moored nearby formed the line later remembered as Battleship Row. Around the island were Army and Navy airfields, including Wheeler, Hickam, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe. These names would soon become part of the same morning's record. But on the last quiet day, there were still stations, runways, hangars, ships, barracks, mess halls, patrol routes, and watch schedules. The machinery of defense existed. The question was whether it was aligned with the threat that was actually coming. The two senior American commanders in Hawaii carried different responsibilities. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel commanded the United States Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short commanded Army forces in Hawaii. Together, their commands guarded the island base and the fleet inside it. Their problem was not simply whether war was possible. That was already understood. Their problem was identifying what kind of attack might come, where it might come from, and how soon it might arrive. Washington's late November messages warned of danger. The naval warning of November 27, 1941, was explicit that war with Japan was possible and possibly imminent. But the warning pointed toward a broad Pacific crisis, not toward a confirmed air attack on Oahu. It did not say that Japanese carriers were moving through northern seas toward Hawaii. It did not identify Pearl Harbor as the selected target. It did not describe the hour, the route, the number of aircraft, or the composition of the attacking force. That distinction matters. A commander can receive a general warning and still not know which defense to place first. In Hawaii, there were several possible fears. Sabotage was one of them. The islands contained military aircraft, fuel, ships, ammunition, and communications facilities. If war came, local sabotage against these assets seemed plausible. General Short's response to the late November warnings focused heavily on that risk. Aircraft were concentrated so they could be guarded more easily. Under one threat model, this was a sensible precaution. Under another, it created a dangerous concentration of targets. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor begins in that gap between threat models. A force prepared mainly against sabotage is not arranged the same way as a force expecting a mass carrier airstrike. A harbor guarded against local intrusion is not necessarily ready for waves of aircraft launched from carriers north of Oahu. A radar contact, a submarine report, or a diplomatic intercept can matter only if the command system is prepared to interpret it as part of the right pattern. That pattern existed, but it was largely on the Japanese side. The Japanese carrier strike force, known as the Kido Butai, had assembled in northern Japan and departed for Hawaii on November 26, 1941. Under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, it included 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. Its route toward Hawaii used a northern approach across rough winter seas and less traveled waters that reduced the chance of detection. This was not an accidental movement. It was a calculated approach designed to preserve surprise until the carriers could launch their aircraft north of Oahu. American commanders in Hawaii did not know that this force was there. That absence of knowledge shaped everything. Admiral Kimmel could know that Japan might act, yet not know that the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor was already inside the operational reach of 6 Japanese carriers. General Short could know that Hawaii was vulnerable, yet not know that the first major assault would come from the air. Washington could read signs of diplomatic rupture through Japanese messages known as magic, yet those decrypts did not reveal the detailed military plan for Pearl Harbor. So the last quiet day was not truly quiet at the strategic level. It was quiet locally, in the way a place can be quiet when danger has not yet taken a form that people can recognize. Messages existed. Warnings existed. Defensive systems existed, but each belonged to a different channel. Diplomacy, Naval Command, Army Defense, Harbor Patrol, radar, intelligence. The coming attack would expose the spaces between them. In Washington, officials were watching Japanese diplomacy with increasing alarm. United States personnel had access to decrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic under the cover name Magic. On December 6th and 7th, a 14-part Japanese diplomatic message would be intercepted and processed, indicating a rupture in relations. But diplomatic intelligence is not the same as tactical warning. It could signal that a break was near without saying where Japanese aircraft carriers were, what course they were steering, or which American base had been selected for attack. That is another key contradiction. Some information can be accurate and still insufficient. Some warning can be urgent and still not operational. Some commanders can be alert to war and still unprepared for the actual first blow. On Oahu, the systems that might have caught the final approach were not fully mature. The Army operated mobile SCR-270 early warning radar units on the island, but radar training and the air warning system were still developing in December 1941. Radar could detect aircraft at a distance, but detection was only the beginning. Someone had to receive the report, understand it, identify the contact, and connect it to action. Without trained procedures and urgency, a real signal could become only a technical fact. The same would be true at sea. The defensive waters outside Pearl Harbor were watched, and the minesweeper USS Condor would soon report a submarine periscope near the harbor entrance. The destroyer USS Ward, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William W. Capselling. Outerbridge would attack and sink a Japanese midget submarine before the air raid began. Ward would report that it had attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in the defensive sea area. That report was real. Decades later, the discovery of a Japanese midget submarine wreck by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory in 2002 would support the historical record of the encounter. But on the morning itself, the report did not produce a fleet-wide or island-wide alert in time. These episodes still lay just ahead. On the last quiet day, they were possibilities not yet tested, radar sets waiting on high ground, patrol vessels moving through assigned waters, aircraft parked on fields, ships tied to moorings, staffs reading messages, officers making judgments under uncertainty. The men at the center of the American command structure were not caricatures of blindness. Kimmel and Short operated inside a real strategic warning environment, but one filled with ambiguity. They had been warned that war might come. They had not been told that Pearl Harbor would be struck by carrier aircraft on a Sunday morning. That difference does not erase responsibility, but it explains the shape of the failure. Pearl Harbor was not simply a story of no warning. It was a story of warnings that did not converge. By the evening of December 6, 1941, the Pacific Fleet remained in harbor. Army aircraft remained on Oahu's fields. The island's defense posture reflected the dangers its commanders believed most immediate. Far to the north, the Japanese carrier force was closing the distance through cold seas. In Washington, fragments of diplomatic evidence were being handled in offices and channels far removed from the harbor. Across Oahu, the geography of the coming attack was already in place. The anchorage, Ford Island, Battleship Row, the airfields, the approaches from the north. The stage had been set quietly. The fleet had been moved forward long before the final day began. And in that forward position, Pearl Harbor had become not just a base, but the center of a widening circle of risk. The fleet had been moved forward long before the final warnings arrived. That fact matters because Pearl Harbor was not an improvised target in December 1941. It had already become the visible center of American naval power in the Pacific. Since April 1940, the United States Pacific Fleet had been stationed there, far from the West Coast, and much closer to the zone of crisis that was expanding across the ocean. The move placed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, auxiliaries, aircraft, repair facilities, fuel storage, and command routines into a single Hawaiian setting. It was meant to signal strength. It was meant to support deterrences. But it also fixed the fleet in a place that could be studied, mapped, and imagined as a target. Pearl Harbor was not just a harbor. It was an operating system. Its value came from geography. Oahu sat in the Central Pacific, a fortified island with sea approaches, airfields, naval installations, and army defenses bound together by distance, roads, communications, and assumptions. To American planners, Hawaii was a shield and a base. From there, the fleet could project power westward. From there, patrols and reinforcements could support a wider Pacific defense. But the same geography that made Oahu valuable also made it finite. The anchorage, the airfields, and the harbor entrance all existed within a relatively compressed island space. If an enemy reached that space with surprise, the important places were not abstract. They were visible, named, and clustered. Inside Pearl Harbor, Ford Island lay at the center of the naval anchorage. Around it were moorings, docks, channels, and the familiar geometry of a fleet at rest. Along the southeast side of Ford Island was Battleship Row, the line of great warships that would become one of the most remembered images of the attack. In peacetime routine, these ships represented mass, endurance, and prestige. Their presence communicated that the United States had placed its principal Pacific naval force in Hawaii. In wartime calculation, that same concentration offered an enemy the possibility of a sudden blow against symbols and instruments of power at the same time. The phrase Battleship Row can sound, in hindsight, almost staged for disaster. But before the attack, it was part of the ordinary language of a naval base. Ships needed anchorage. Crews needed access to shore. Repairs, maintenance, liberty, fueling, provisioning, and command required proximity. A fleet could not remain at sea indefinitely simply because danger existed somewhere beyond the horizon. The life of a navy depended on bases, and Pearl Harbor was the base selected for the Pacific Fleet's forward posture. That forward posture carried a political weight as well as a military one. The presence of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor was a message. It told Japan that American naval strength was no longer held primarily at a continental distance. It placed heavy American ships inside the Pacific theater, nearer to routes and territories that mattered in a crisis. But messages in international affairs are rarely heard in only one way. A force placed forward to deter can also become a force an adversary believes must be neutralized at the opening of war. This was the contradiction built into the harbor before the last day began. Oahu's military geography extended beyond the ships. The island's airfields formed another part of the target system. Hickam, Wheeler, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe were not incidental names on a map. They were places where aircraft were based, maintained, and made ready. They connected the Army and Navy defense of the island to the air. If the fleet in Pearl Harbor was to be protected against a carrier raid, the aircraft on Oahu mattered. If an enemy wanted to prevent American air response, those fields mattered just as much. The final warnings of December would unfold across this landscape. Messages would arrive for commanders responsible not for an empty island, but for a dense arrangement of forces. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel commanded the United States Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant General Walter C. Sol Short commanded Army forces in Hawaii. Their responsibilities overlapped in the defense of Oahu, but they were not identical. Kimmel's world centered on the fleet, sea approaches, naval readiness, and the operating needs of ships. Short's world centered on Army defense, island security, airfields, anti-aircraft preparations, and protection against threats to installations. The island required coordination between these worlds, because the attack that came would not respect the lines between them. The harbor itself had a narrow and controlled relationship with the open sea. Ships entered and left through defined approaches. The water inside held the fleet, the ocean outside held uncertainty. In the early morning of December 7th, that boundary would become critical when a submarine Periscope was reported near the harbor entrance and when USS Ward later attacked a midget submarine in the defensive sea area. Those events belonged to the tactical morning of the attack, but the reason they mattered was already present in the geography. Pearl Harbor was not an exposed roadstead. It was a protected naval base with an entrance, patrol areas, and defensive assumptions. A suspicious contact near that entrance was a warning not only about one small submarine, but about the possibility that the harbor's protected boundary had already been touched. The air boundary was harder to see. Oahu was surrounded by ocean and sky. Aircraft could approach from beyond visual range, and in 1941, the Army's mobile SCR-270 early warning radar units were still part of an immature air warning system. That meant the island's northern approaches, including the area near Kahuku Point and the Opana radar site, would become part of the story not because they looked dramatic on a map, but because they marked the edge of detection. On the morning of the attack, radar operators at Opana would see the incoming first wave before the aircraft reached Oahu. But on the day before, the system that would receive and interpret such a sighting was still not fully developed. Technology existed, but technology alone did not create warning. It had to be linked to procedure, command judgment, and timely action. This is why the geography of Oahu cannot be separated from the failures that followed. Warnings do not act on open space. They arrive in institutions. They point toward ships, aircraft, roads, telephones, command posts, patrol vessels, radar sets, and human decisions. A message from Washington had to be interpreted in relation to actual local defenses. A submarine sighting had to move through naval channels quickly enough to alter readiness. A radar contact had to be understood as hostile before the planes arrived over the island. In each case, the physical layout of Pearl Harbor and Oahu gave the warning its meaning. The fleet's presence also shaped the stakes of any misunderstanding. Had the Pacific Fleet remained based primarily on the West Coast, Pearl Harbor would still have been a military installation, but it would not have held the same concentration of capital ships. By December 1941, however, the forward basing decision had made the harbor a central point in both American strategy and Japanese planning. The target was not created by one careless morning. It was created over months by strategic movement, political crisis, and the practical needs of a fleet operating from Hawaii. Inside that setting, ordinary routines continued. Ships lay at anchor. Airfields held aircraft. Commanders managed readiness under uncertain guidance. There was no confirmed message saying that Pearl Harbor would be attacked by carrier aircraft from the north. There was no single final alarm that transformed the island into a state of full air defense before dawn. Instead, there was a base of great importance waiting inside a widening crisis, with its assets arranged according to the threat models its commanders considered most urgent. That distinction is essential. Pearl Harbor's vulnerability was not simply the result of being unprepared in every sense. It was the result of being prepared for some dangers more than others. A harbor can be guarded against sabotage. Aircraft can be arranged so sentries can watch them. Patrols can monitor sea approaches. Messages can warn of war. But if the actual blow comes by carrier aircraft launched from far north of the island, if it arrives before the warnings converge, then preparations built around a different expectation can become part of the disaster. The Japanese attack force was still far away from the harbor's visible routines, but the target geography was already fixed. Ford Island, Battleship Row, the harbor entrance, the airfields, the radar sites, and the command centers formed the stage on which the final signals would appear. Each place would matter because each place connected one kind of warning to one kind of response. By the time late November messages reached Admiral Kimmel and General Short, Pearl Harbor was already more than a station. It was a symbol, a fleet base, a deterrent, a logistical hub, and a vulnerable concentration of power. Washington could warn that war might be near. It could point to the danger of Japanese action somewhere in the Pacific. But the meaning of those warnings had to be worked out on Oahu, among ships at anchor and aircraft on fields, with the fleet already in the crosshairs before anyone could name the exact direction of the coming attack. The warnings arrived after Pearl Harbor had already become a forward concentration of American power. That was the central tension. Washington could see a crisis widening across the Pacific, and it could warn its commanders that Japanese action might be near. But the warning had to travel from strategic concern to local decision. It had to become watches, patrols, aircraft dispersal, anti-aircraft readiness, harbor defense, and command urgency on Oahu. In late November 1941, that process began in writing. The most famous of the messages went to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the United States Pacific Fleet. It was sent on November 27, 1941, and it opened with a phrase that has remained central to the history of Pearl Harbor. It identified itself as a war warning. Those words were direct. They were not cautious diplomatic language. They were not routine background. They told Kimmel that the situation had moved beyond ordinary tension. Washington believed that hostilities with Japan were possible and that American forces in the Pacific had to consider the danger immediate enough to require military attention. But the message also carried a limitation that would shape everything that followed. It warned of war without naming Pearl Harbor as the point of attack. That distinction is not a technicality. It is one of the keys to understanding the final days before December 7. The warning from Washington did not leave Kimmel in ignorance about the danger of conflict. He knew the crisis was grave. He knew Japan might act. He knew the Pacific was moving toward a break. But the message did not say that a Japanese carrier force was already preparing to strike Oahu. It did not describe the Kido Butai at sea. It did not identify the northern approach to Hawaii. It did not describe torpedo bombers coming toward Battleship Row, or dive bombers over Ford Island, or fighters over Wheeler, Hickam, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe. It was a war warning, but not a Pearl Harbor attack warning. A separate warning also went to Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, the Army commander in Hawaii. Like Kimmel, Short was responsible for a command that stood at the edge of the Pacific crisis. But his responsibility was different. Kimmel commanded the fleet. Short commanded Army forces on Oahu, including the defense of airfields and the island's military installations. If war came to Hawaii, the Navy and the Army would face the same enemy from different positions and with different assumptions about what mattered most. Washington's late November warnings told both men that the danger was real. Yet they did not give either man the one thing that, in retrospect, seems most necessary: a confirmed target. The messages pointed outward, toward a broad Pacific emergency. They reflected the American understanding that Japanese action might occur somewhere across a vast theater. The danger could involve the Philippines. It could involve British or Dutch possessions in the Western Pacific. It could involve sea lanes and bases far from Hawaii. From Washington, the map of danger was enormous. Pearl Harbor was important, but it was not singled out in the warning as the place where the blow would fall. That uncertainty mattered because military warning is not just information. It is a demand for interpretation. A commander must decide what kind of attack is most likely, what resources can be used, what readiness level can be sustained, and what risks must be accepted. A warning that says war may be imminent creates pressure. A warning that says exactly where and how an attack will occur creates a different kind of pressure. In late November, Kimmel and Short received the first kind. The messages also reached commands that already had established routines and existing threat models. Pearl Harbor was a fleet base, not merely an exposed anchorage. It had ships, repair facilities, fuel, aircraft, communications, and layered command responsibilities. Oahu had airfields, coastal defenses, harbor approaches, and military posts spread across the island. A general alarm could not be a single action. It had to be translated into many smaller choices. For the Navy, the war warning raised questions of fleet readiness, reconnaissance, patrols, and the possibility of Japanese movement somewhere in the Pacific. For the Army, the warning raised questions about how to protect aircraft, installations, and ammunition against a sudden hostile act. The same strategic message could lead to different local priorities. This is where the late November warnings become more than documents in an archive. They show the gap between awareness and preparation. Washington had communicated danger, but the danger remained general enough that local commanders still had to decide what it meant. There was no absence of warning in the simple sense. The record does not support the image of commanders in Hawaii receiving nothing but quiet routine. They had been told that the international situation was dangerous. They had been told that hostile action was possible. Kimmel received a naval message that explicitly called itself a war warning. Short received late November warning information as well. The issue was not silence. The issue was precision, interpretation, and response. Pearl Harbor's tragedy sits inside that difference. If a message had said that Japanese carriers were approaching from north of Oahu, the meaning would have been plain. If it had said that a first wave of aircraft would launch at about 6 in the morning on December 7, the response would have been immediate. If it had said that the incoming aircraft would be Nakajima Kate torpedo and level bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and Mitsubishi Zero fighters, there would have been no room for a sabotage alert to become the dominant lens. But Washington did not possess and did not send such a message. The available intelligence was fragmented, LEAP. American codebreakers had access to Japanese diplomatic traffic known as magic, but those decrypts did not reveal the detailed military plan for Pearl Harbor. Diplomatic intelligence could show that relations were breaking down. It could indicate crisis and urgency, but it did not show the location of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, and it did not reveal the tactical plan unfolding across the northern Pacific. The result was a warning, environment filled with seriousness, but lacking final clarity. That lack of clarity affected what happened next on Oahu. Kimmel and Short did not ignore the possibility of war, but the warnings did not produce a unified island-wide posture against an imminent carrier air raid. In the final accounting, this distinction would become painful. The late November warnings were strong enough to prove that danger had been recognized. They were not specific enough to force every defensive measure that hindsight would later demand. For General Short, the most important interpretation became the danger of sabotage. This was not an irrational concern in an isolated island command filled with aircraft, fuel, hangars, ammunition, and military facilities. If war was coming, a local act of sabotage against planes or installations seemed plausible. Protecting aircraft from ground attack, infiltration, or internal damage could appear to be the immediate practical problem. But every warning narrows attention as well as expands it. Once sabotage became the dominant threat, the physical arrangement of defense began to follow that assumption. Aircraft could be grouped so guards could watch them more easily. Installations could be protected against local damage. The command could prepare for one kind of opening blow while leaving itself exposed to another. This was the quiet danger inside the war warning from Washington. It carried urgency, but not a target. It told commanders that conflict might be near, but not that Pearl Harbor was about to become the first great battlefield of the Pacific War. It left room for judgment, and in that room, each command filled in the blank according to its responsibilities, fears, and available evidence. By the end of November, the warning had been sent. The words were on record. The danger had been formally recognized. Yet on Oahu, the meaning of that warning was still being shaped into local action. For the Army commander in Hawaii, the danger would soon be viewed most sharply through one particular lens, not aircraft descending from the north, but sabotage on the ground. The warning from Washington did not arrive on an empty desk. It arrived in a command environment already shaped by duties, assumptions, and practical fears. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short was responsible for Army forces in Hawaii. His responsibility was not the same as Admiral Husband E. Kimmel's responsibility for the Pacific Fleet. Kimmel had to think in terms of ships, sea lanes, scouting, and the movement of naval forces. Short had to think in terms of the defense of Oahu itself, its airfields, its installations, its soldiers, and the possibility that war might begin not with a distant fleet appearing over the horizon, but with damage done from within. That distinction mattered. When the late November warnings reached Hawaii, they told American commanders that Japanese action was possible, even imminent. They did not identify Pearl Harbor as the specific point of attack. They did not say that a Japanese carrier force was already at sea, moving across the northern Pacific. They did not tell Short that the first blows would come from aircraft launched far north of Oahu. In the space left open by that uncertainty, Short had to decide what kind of danger was most immediate. He focused heavily on sabotage. In Hawaii, sabotage was not an abstract concern. Oahu held a dense concentration of military value. Pearl Harbor contained the fleet. Ford Island sat inside the harbor. Battleship Row lined part of its eastern side. Nearby were Army and Navy airfields whose aircraft would be essential if an attack came. Wheeler, Hickam, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe were not just names on a map. They were pieces of a defensive system. Aircraft based there could scout, intercept, attack, or train. But on the ground, there were also machines that could be destroyed by fire, explosives, or local action before they ever left the runway. Short's response must be understood through that frame. He was not ignoring the existence of danger. He was choosing the form of danger against which he believed his command had to guard most urgently. If sabotage was the threat, then dispersing aircraft widely across fields could make them harder to protect. Planes spread out over large areas required more guards, more patrols, more fencing, more lights, and more attention. A saboteur did not need to sink a battleship to produce military damage. A small explosive charge, a fire, or an act of coordinated destruction among parked aircraft could weaken the island's defenses before any wider conflict was fully recognized. So, aircraft were concentrated so they could be more easily guarded. This was the central irony. Under one threat model, the measure was logical. If the danger was local sabotage, concentration simplified defense. Guards could watch clustered aircraft. Commanders could place men around known groupings. Access could be controlled more directly. The physical layout of planes on the airfields became an answer to the danger Short emphasized. It was a defensive measure, not a gesture of carelessness. It was a way of taking the warning seriously, but taking it seriously in a particular direction. The tragedy was that another kind of attack made the same arrangement disastrous. An air raid rewards concentration. Bombs and bullets become more effective when targets are grouped. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, or otherwise gathered closely enough to be guarded as a cluster, become easier to damage from above. A measure designed to reduce the risk from a man with explosives on the ground can increase the vulnerability to aircraft attacking from the sky. In the final hours before Pearl Harbor, this was not merely a theoretical problem. It was a collision between two different ideas of how war might begin. Short's sabotage lens also reveals something larger about warning itself. A warning is not complete simply because it has been sent. It must be interpreted. It must be translated into action. It must pass through the existing responsibilities and habits of the people who receive it. Washington had warned of danger, but did not provide a confirmed tactical picture of a Pearl Harbor air attack. The result was not silence in Hawaii. It was selective action. One danger was emphasized. Another remained insufficiently prepared for no. This is one of the quietest and most important patterns in the Pearl Harbor story. There were warnings, but they did not all point in the same way. Some were strategic, suggesting that relations with Japan were nearing a break. Some were naval, concerned with possible movement and conflict across the Pacific. Some would later be tactical, including reports from the harbor approaches and signals from radar. But before the morning of December 7th, the warning that mattered most to Short was the danger that military assets on Oahu might be attacked from within. The island setting made the problem sharper. Oahu was both a fortress and a community. Military installations existed near civilian life, roads, workers, and daily movement. The Army had to guard against the possibility that an enemy might not need to cross the Pacific in open formation to do harm. In this environment, sabotage seemed immediate because it could be imagined as close at hand. A carrier strike, by contrast, required a chain of assumptions that was harder to see without specific intelligence. Enemy carriers at sea, undetected approach, launch range north of the island, and a coordinated strike timed to arrive before defenses were ready. Short did not possess that chain as a confirmed warning. This does not erase responsibility. It defines the nature of the failure. The defense of Oahu depended not only on having forces in place, but on arranging them against the right threat. Aircraft were among the most important tools the island had. If they survived, they could respond. If they were destroyed on the ground, the island's ability to react would be weakened at the first moment of crisis. The sabotage precautions protected those aircraft against one imagined opening blow while exposing them to another. That exposure would become visible only when the attack began. Before that, it existed quietly in the layout of the fields. It existed in the placement of machines, in guard routines, in assumptions about what kind of enemy action was most likely. The danger was built into ordinary arrangements. Nothing had to happen yet for the consequences to be prepared. This is why Short's decision is so important to the final 24 hours. It shows that the American problem was not simply a lack of warning. It was a mismatch between warning and interpretation. The late November messages created urgency, but they did not settle the question of direction. Short answered that question with Sabotage Satch. His answer shaped the ground reality on Oahu. Meanwhile, far beyond the island, a different reality was already moving. The danger Short had not centered was not merely possible. It was taking form in the northern Pacific. A Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, had assembled in northern Japan and departed for Hawaii on November 26. Under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 6 carriers moved through rough winter seas on a northern approach designed to reduce the chance of detection. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku were not a rumor inside a warning message. They were steel decks, aircraft, pilots, fuel, and intent, closing the distance while Oahu guarded itself against a different first blow. While Oahu arranged its defenses around the fear of sabotage, the force that would make that assumption so costly was already at sea. It was not visible from Hawaii. It was not named in the late November warnings sent from Washington. It did not appear as a confirmed position on an American chart. But in the northern Pacific, beyond the normal sightlines of the island, Japan's carrier striking force was moving eastward. The Japanese called that force the Kido Butai. In the Pearl Harbor operation, it was the central instrument of the attack, a carrier force built around aviation rather than battleship gunfire. Its commander was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Above him stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, the officer associated with the broader concept of striking the American Pacific Fleet at its base. Commander Minoru Genda was associated with the planning of the carrier aircraft operation, the part of the plan that translated strategic intent into waves of aircraft, flight paths, weapons, and timing. The American warning problem looks different when viewed from the decks of those carriers. In Washington and Hawaii, commanders were trying to interpret signs of danger. At sea, the Japanese force was not interpreting. It was executing. The orders had become movement. The ships had gathered. The route had been chosen. The aircraft had been prepared for a mission that depended on secrecy until the last possible moment. The assembly point was in northern Japan, described in sources as Tankan Bay or Hitokapu Bay. The location mattered. It placed the striking force away from the more heavily observed southern routes and closer to the cold northern waters through which it would begin its approach. From there, the carriers and their supporting ships departed for Hawaii on November 26, 1941. That date sits quietly in the larger chronology, but it is one of the dividing lines in the story. On November 27, Washington sent the naval message that began by calling itself a war warning. On Oahu, Lieutenant General Walter C. Short would shape his response around the danger of sabotage. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel would operate under the burden of a Pacific crisis whose exact direction remained uncertain. But one day before that warning was sent, the Japanese strike force had already left its northern anchorage. This does not mean the American warnings were meaningless. They reflected a real sense that war might be near. But the timing reveals the gap between strategic warning and operational knowledge. The United States could warn of Japanese action somewhere in the Pacific. It could read the diplomatic crisis as worsening. It could understand that the region was unstable and dangerous. What it did not have was a confirmed warning that a carrier force had sailed from northern Japan toward Hawaii. The carriers at the heart of the force were Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. The names would become inseparable from the attack. Together, they represented an extraordinary concentration of naval air power. Each was more than a ship. Each was a mobile airfield carrying aircraft, crews, mechanics, fuel, ordnance, and the trained routines needed to launch a coordinated strike across open ocean. Akagi served as Nagumo's flagship. Around her were the other 5 carriers, each contributing to the massive aircraft that would later approach Oahu from the north. Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku formed, with Akagi, the carrier core of the Hawaii operation. Their presence at sea changed the meaning of distance. Pearl Harbor was protected by ocean, but carriers turned ocean into a path rather than a barrier. A fleet no longer had to close for a surface battle before striking. It could send aircraft ahead, over the horizon, long before the ships themselves were seen. The route chosen for the Kido Butai was a northern approach across the Pacific. That route was not accidental. It used rough winter weather and less traveled seas to reduce the chance of detection. The northern Pacific in late autumn and early winter was harsh water, heavy seas, cold weather, and difficult conditions for ships and men. But those same conditions offered concealment. Bad weather could be a shield. Empty sea lanes could be a form of camouflage. For a carrier operation, secrecy was not a supporting detail. It was the foundation. The Japanese plan required the force to cross a vast distance without being discovered, then arrive north of Oahu in a position from which aircraft could be launched at dawn. If the force were sighted too early, the advantage of surprise could collapse. Pearl Harbor might go to full alert. Aircraft might be dispersed differently. Ships might sortie or prepare for attack. Anti-aircraft defenses might be fully manned. Patrols might search the northern sector with a different urgency. The northern route therefore connected geography to surprise. It exploited not simply distance, but expectations. American commanders understood that war with Japan might come. They understood that Japanese action was possible in the Pacific. But the location and form of that action remained uncertain. Much attention in the broader crisis naturally fell toward Southeast Asia and other points of Japanese pressure. The idea of a carrier force crossing the northern Pacific to strike Pearl Harbor was not the confirmed content of the warning messages reaching Hawaii. This is one of the quiet ironies of the last days before the attack. The most dangerous force in the story was also the least visible to those who needed to respond to it. It was not a diplomatic phrase. It was not a rumor of sabotage. It was not an intercepted message naming Pearl Harbor as the target. It was a moving naval formation protected by radio discipline, weather, distance, and route selection. The men aboard those ships were also moving inside a carefully timed operation. The goal was not merely to reach the waters north of Hawaii. The force had to arrive at the right place at the right time, with enough fuel, readiness, and order to launch aircraft before the island could react. Carrier warfare depended on coordination. Aircraft had to be spotted on decks. Engines had to be warmed. Pilots had to be briefed. Weapons had to be matched to targets. The first wave had to lift from the carriers and form up over the ocean before turning toward Oahu. By the morning of December 7, the force would be north of Oahu. At about 6 o'clock, it would launch its first wave of aircraft. That first wave would later be detected by Army radar at Opana, appearing as a large formation far to the north. But at the stage we are tracing now, before the morning signals and the radar plot and the reports from the harbor entrance, the essential fact is simpler. The Japanese striking force was closing in from the one direction that remained outside the imagination of the local alert. Nagumo's force also shows why the Pearl Harbor attack cannot be understood only from the American side of the warning chain. Warnings failed, in part, because they were incomplete. But they were incomplete because the Japanese operation was designed to be hidden. The Northern Assembly, the November 26 departure, and the passage through rough winter seas were not background details. They were mechanisms of surprise. They turned the Pacific into a concealment zone, For the American defenders, uncertainty produced interpretation. For the Japanese attackers, uncertainty was something to be imposed on the enemy. The Kido Butai's movement created a dangerous separation between reality and awareness. Reality was 6 carriers moving steadily toward launch position. Awareness, in Hawaii, remained shaped by general warnings, local responsibilities, and the sabotage lens that had arranged aircraft on the ground for guarding rather than air attack. The names of the carriers are worth holding in the mind because they mark the scale of the operation. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. This was not a small raid by a few aircraft operating at the edge of possibility. It was a concentrated carrier attack force, organized to deliver multiple kinds of aircraft against naval and air targets on Oahu. By the time the first wave appeared over the island, its success would depend not only on having crossed the ocean unseen, but on whether its weapons could work against the particular conditions of Pearl Harbor itself. That problem had been studied before the carriers reached launch position. Pearl Harbor was not open deep water. Its average depth was about 45 feet, a serious obstacle for aerial torpedoes that normally plunge downward after release. If the Japanese intended to attack the ships along Battleship Row with torpedo aircraft, they had to solve the shallow water problem before the planes ever left the deck's witness. The force at sea carried not only pilots and aircraft, but also the results of technical preparation, altered weapons, planned roles, and aircraft types chosen for a harbor strike. The voyage across the northern Pacific was the movement of a fleet, but it was also the movement of a carefully engineered attack toward the specific waters of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese force moving toward Hawaii carried a problem inside its plan. The problem was not distance. The northern route had been chosen to reduce the chance of discovery. It was not only coordination. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, had been organized for a single striking purpose under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The problem was water. Pearl Harbor was a naval base, but it was not a deep ocean anchorage. Its average depth was about 45 feet. That fact mattered because one of the most dangerous weapons in a carrier attack, the aerial torpedo, did not simply skim into the sea and run straight to its target. Dropped from an aircraft, it normally entered the water with force, plunged downward, stabilized, and then began its run. In deep water, that behavior could be allowed for. In a shallow harbor, it could ruin the attack. A torpedo that dived too deeply might strike the bottom before it ever reached a battleship. This was one reason Pearl Harbor had seemed, to many minds, less vulnerable to aerial torpedo attack than a fleet at sea. The ships moored along Battleship Row were dangerous targets, but they were sitting inside a harbor whose depth imposed a technical limit. If the torpedoes behaved as ordinary torpedoes behaved, the harbor itself might defeat them. The Japanese planners did not accept that limit as fixed. The shallow water problem had to be solved before the first aircraft took off. It could not be improvised over Oahu. It had to be built into the weapons, tested in concept, and carried across the Pacific as part of the attack force. The modifications were practical and physical. Japanese aerial torpedoes were fitted with wooden fins, a simple material used for a precise purpose, to help control the torpedo's entry into the water and reduce the depth of its dive after release. The arming devices were also altered so that the weapon could function within the short run and unusual conditions of the harbor. These changes were not dramatic in appearance when compared with the scale of a carrier fleet. They were not great ships or new aircraft. They were pieces of engineering attached to individual weapons. But they reflected one of the most important facts about the coming attack. The operation was not merely a gamble that surprise would make up for weakness. It was also an attempt to adapt equipment to a specific target. Pearl Harbor had been studied not only as a symbol of American power, but as a physical place. It had channels, anchorages, mooring positions, airfields, and shallow water. The Japanese attack plan treated those details as operational facts. The water depth inside the harbor shaped the design of the weapon. The arrangement of ships around Ford Island shaped the choice of targets. The need to suppress American air response shaped the use of fighters and bombers against Oahu's airfields. The aircraft aboard the Japanese carriers were therefore not interchangeable. Each type had a role in the larger design. The Nakajima B-5N Kate was central to the torpedo attack. In the Pearl Harbor operation, the Kate served both as a torpedo bomber and as a level bomber. That dual use mattered. Some Kates would come in low, carrying the modified torpedoes intended for ships in the harbor. Others would attack from higher altitude with bombs aimed at heavy ships and harbor targets. The same basic aircraft type could therefore participate in two different forms of attack, one dependent on the shallow water torpedo modifications, the other on level bombing pencil. The Aichi D3A1 Val had a different role. It was the dive bomber, built for steep attacks that allowed pilots to aim at more specific targets from above. In a harbor and island attack, dive bombers could be used against ships, facilities, and airfield targets. Their method was different from the torpedo run. A torpedo plane had to come in low and release its weapon on a path that gave the torpedo a chance to settle and run. A dive bomber descended toward its target, released its bomb, and pulled out. Both methods demanded training. Both depended on timing. But they attacked from different angles and imposed different pressures on the defenders. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Ziri completed the main carrier aircraft combination. The Zero was the fighter. Its purpose was to protect the strike formation and to attack enemy aircraft and airfields. In the context of Oahu, that role had a special importance. The Japanese plan depended not only on damaging ships, but on reducing the ability of American aircraft to rise against the attacking force. Fighters could strafe parked planes, cover bombers, and help maintain control of the air during the critical opening minutes. Together, the Vals, Kates, and Zeros formed the striking arm of the Kido Butai. Their names would later become familiar in accounts of the attack, but in the final hours before Pearl Harbor, they were still aircraft aboard carriers in the Northern Pacific, assigned to carefully divided tasks. The Kates carried the central answer to the shallow water question. The Vals brought dive bombing capability. The Zeros provided fighter cover and attack power against aircraft on the ground. The technical preparation of the torpedoes also shows why the attack cannot be understood only as a failure of American warning. Warning was central to the story, but so was planning. The Japanese force was not approaching with a vague intention to strike somewhere if the opportunity appeared. It was carrying weapons adapted for the known conditions of Pearl Harbor. The wooden fins and altered arming devices were evidence of an attack shaped around the harbor itself. That is what made the distance between Washington's general warnings and the actual Japanese plan so consequential. American commanders knew war might be near. They had been told that Japanese action was possible. They were alert to danger in the Pacific. But the specific form of the danger, carrier aircraft from the north, carrying shallow water torpedoes toward Battleship Row, was not known to them as a confirmed operational fact. Inside that gap, assumption survived. A harbor could appear protected by its own depth. Aircraft could be grouped for guarding against sabotage. Patrols and alerts could be shaped by the threats commanders thought most likely. Meanwhile, the Japanese had converted one of the harbor's apparent defenses into an engineering requirement and then answered it with modified weapons. The contrast is quiet but severe. On Oahu, defensive arrangements were being made under uncertainty. At sea, the attacking force carried a more definite picture of what it intended to do. The Japanese pilots did not need to understand the entire diplomatic crisis. They did not need to know what messages had moved between Tokyo and Washington. Their assigned tasks were operational. Fly from the carriers. Approach Oahu. Strike ships and airfields. Use weapons prepared for the harbor's conditions. The torpedoes, in that sense, were part of the warning story even before they were dropped. They revealed that the attack was not a generic raid against an island. It was a tailored strike against a particular naval base. The average depth of Pearl Harbor, about 45 feet, had been turned from a reason for doubt into a design problem. The solution was already aboard the carriers before the final morning began. Yet on the American side, the most sensitive information available in early December did not come from watching those carriers or inspecting those weapons. It came from another domain entirely, diplomatic code-breaking. While the Kido Butai carried modified torpedoes through the northern Pacific, United States personnel were reading portions of Japanese diplomatic traffic
under the cover name Magic.
Those messages would point toward a break in relations. They would show crisis at the highest level, but they would not describe wooden fins, altered arming devices, the launch position north of Oahu, or the aircraft formations that would soon turn technical preparation into an attack.
The modified torpedoes aboard the Japanese carriers belonged to a world of metal, water, and flight.
Magic belonged to another world. Intercepted messages, code groups, translation desks, distribution lists, and locked channels inside Washington. In the final hours before the attack, these two worlds were moving at the same time. One was closing on Oahu across the northern Pacific. The other was producing fragments of insight from Japanese diplomatic traffic. The tragedy was that the Second World revealed crisis, but not the shape of the first. Magic was the cover name used by the United States for intelligence derived from decrypted Japanese diplomatic messages. It was among the most sensitive information available to American officials before the attack on Pearl Harbor. These were not ordinary newspaper reports or open diplomatic statements.
They were communications meant for Japanese officials, intercepted and processed by American personnel.
They could show pressure, timing, and intention at the level of diplomacy. They could help Washington understand that relations between Japan and the United States were reaching a breaking point. But magic had a boundary. It was diplomatic intelligence, not a window into every military order of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The messages available to United States personnel did not reveal the detailed Japanese military plan for Pearl Harbor. They did not name the location of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force. They did not report that Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zukaku, and Shokaku were approaching from the north. They did not describe the launch point north of Oahu, the first wave, the second wave, or the intended sequence of strikes against Battleship Row, Ford Island, and the airfields. They showed danger at the level of national relations. They did not draw the tactical map. This distinction matters because Pearl Harbor has often been remembered through the language of warning. There were warnings. There were many kinds of signals. Late November had already brought official warnings from Washington to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Fighter. Short, those warnings told commanders in Hawaii that war with Japan was possible and perhaps imminent. But they did not identify Pearl Harbor as the confirmed point of attack. Magic added another layer to this atmosphere of crisis. It sharpened the sense that diplomatic relations were near rupture. Yet it still did not answer the operational questions that would have mattered most in the harbor. From what direction, by what force, at what hour, and against which targets. On December 6 and December 7, United States personnel intercepted and processed a Japanese diplomatic message that became one of the most examined documents of the entire Pearl Harbor story. It was a 14-part message. Its content signaled a rupture in relations between Japan and the United States. It was long, formal, and diplomatic, but its importance lay in what it implied. A government does not send such a message in such a moment without consequence. To those reading it inside the American system, it was one more indication that the crisis had moved beyond negotiation as usual. The first 13 parts were intercepted before the final part. The research record notes Bainbridge Island as a Navy intercept site, connected with those first 13 parts. From there, the message entered the larger machinery of interception, decryption, processing, and distribution. Each step mattered. Intelligence is sometimes imagined as if a secret, once captured, instantly becomes useful knowledge in the hands of everyone who needs it. The final day before Pearl Harbor shows something more complicated. A message could be intercepted in one place, processed in another, read by certain officials, and still not become an effective operational warning in Hawaii. The 14-part message did not say, in plain terms, that Japanese aircraft carriers were about to strike Pearl Harbor. That absence is central. Magic showed that something grave was happening. It did not show the specific military blow already in motion. The Japanese carrier force had left northern Japan on November 26. It was moving by a northern approach through rough winter seas, a route chosen in part because it reduced the chance of detection. Its secrecy did not depend only on code security. It also depended on distance, weather, geography, and the fact that diplomatic code-breaking was not the same as tracking a fleet at sea. Inside Washington, the 14-part message therefore produced a warning problem of a particular kind. It was alarming without being geographically precise. It suggested that the diplomatic crisis was reaching its end, but it did not tell American commanders where the first shot would fall. In early December 1941, American attention had to cover a wide Pacific crisis. Japanese action was feared across a broad theater, not only in Hawaii. The late November warnings had already reflected that wider danger. Magic confirmed the gravity of the diplomatic moment, but it did not convert broad danger into a confirmed Pearl Harbor air raid. This is where the story becomes less about one missing clue and more about systems. The United States had sensitive intelligence. It had commanders under strain. It had separate Army and Navy responsibilities in Hawaii. It had Washington officials interpreting diplomatic messages at the center and field commanders making defensive decisions at the edge of the Pacific. Between those points lay time, procedure, secrecy, assumptions, and communications. Secrecy itself created tension. Magic was highly sensitive. The more people who received such material, the greater the risk of exposing the code-breaking success. But the fewer people who received it, the harder it became to turn a diplomatic insight into an operational change. This was not simply a matter of hiding information from commanders. It was a structural problem in the handling of intelligence. A decrypted diplomatic message could be precious and still incomplete. It could be protected and still fail to protect the fleet. For Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the immediate problem in Hawaii was not how to interpret the exact text of every Japanese diplomatic exchange. Their problem was what kind of attack to expect and how to arrange forces against it. Short had already leaned heavily toward the danger of sabotage, concentrating aircraft so they could be guarded. Kimmel had to think about naval threats across a vast ocean. Magic did not give either commander a clear correction. Prepare at once for carrier aircraft approaching Oahu from the north on Sunday morning. It did not identify the Kido Butai. It did not say that the shallow water torpedo problem had been solved. It did not disclose the aircraft mix of Nakajima Kate torpedo and level bombers, Chival dive bombers, and Mitsubishi Zero fighters. So the 14-part message stands in the Pearl Harbor record with a double meaning. It is evidence that American intelligence had penetrated important Japanese diplomatic communications. It is also evidence of the limits of that penetration. The message pointed toward a break. It did not reveal the blow. That double meaning is essential to understanding why the final 24 hours unfolded as they did. The problem was not that nothing was known. The problem was that what was known did not arrive as a single, unmistakable warning. Diplomatic intelligence suggested rupture. Prior warnings suggested imminent conflict. Local assumptions in Hawaii emphasized sabotage. At sea, Japanese carriers remained unlocated. On Oahu, the air warning system was still immature. Soon, local tactical signals would begin to appear: a submarine sighting, a destroyer report, a radar contact. But each would have to pass through human interpretation and communication before it could become action. By the morning of December 7, the final part of the Japanese diplomatic message and the urgency surrounding it helped produce one more warning from Washington. General George C. Marshall authorized that warning. It was an attempt to turn the accumulated sense of danger into a message that could reach the commanders in Hawaii. But the same distinction still held. Intelligence existing somewhere in the American system was not the same as warning delivered in time, understood in context, and acted upon before the attack began. In the last hours before the planes arrived over Oahu, magic had illuminated the diplomatic edge of war. It had not illuminated the carriers in the northern Pacific. The 14-part message showed that relations were breaking. It did not show the first wave forming on Japanese flight decks. And so, as Washington tried to send its warning across the distance to Hawaii, the most important clock was no longer only diplomatic. It was operational. The message had to travel faster than events already moving toward Pearl Harbor. The previous warning had formed inside a locked world of decrypts, translations, and senior review. By the morning of December 7, that world had produced a judgment that was urgent enough to send onward. General George C. Marshall authorized a warning for Hawaii. It was meant to carry the meaning of the latest Japanese diplomatic traffic across the distance from Washington to the Pacific command posts on Oahu. But the timing had become unforgiving. The problem was not simply whether Washington possessed information. It did. United States personnel had access to Japanese diplomatic messages under the cover name Magic. They had processed the 14-part Japanese message across December 6 and December 7. They had seen enough to understand that relations with Japan were nearing rupture. The problem was whether that understanding could become a usable warning before Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor. That is the distinction at the center of this morning. Intelligence can exist in one place and still fail to protect another. It can be read in Washington, discussed by officials, judged serious by senior officers, and still not reach the field commander in time to alter the conditions on the ground. In the final hours before the attack, the warning authorized by Marshall became a test of the American communication system under pressure. Hawaii was not across town. Pearl Harbor was in the Central Pacific, separated from Washington by distance, time, procedure, and the available channels of communication. On Oahu, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel commanded the United States Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant General Walter C. Zingen Short commanded Army forces in Hawaii. They had already received broad warnings in late November that war with Japan might come. But those earlier warnings had not named Pearl Harbor as the confirmed target of an air raid. They had shaped concern, but they had not delivered a precise operational picture. The morning warning was different in its immediate cause. It followed the late-stage diplomatic crisis revealed in the Japanese message. The 14-part communication did not contain the battle plan. It did not say that the Kido Butai was north of Oahu. It did not identify the launch point, the carriers, the first wave, or the target sequence against Battleship Row and the airfields. Yet it showed that the political break was arriving. In Washington, that was enough to require action. Marshall's warning was an effort to convert strategic alarm into command notification. It was a human decision placed inside a technical system. Someone had to authorize it. Someone had to send it. Someone had to receive it. Someone had to understand it against the local picture in Hawaii. At every step, time could be lost. That morning, time was already being consumed elsewhere. Far north of Oahu, the Japanese carrier strike force had moved into position. At about 6 in the morning, it launched the first wave of aircraft toward Hawaii. Those aircraft were no longer possibilities inside an intelligence estimate. They were machines in the air, torpedo bombers, level bombers, dive bombers, and fighters flying toward military targets on Oahu. While Washington tried to move a warning through communications channels, the attack was already moving through the sky. This is why the chapter cannot be understood only as a story of delay. It is also a story of competing clocks. One clock belonged to Washington: interception, processing, interpretation, authorization, transmission. Another belonged to the Japanese operation: carrier launch, formation, navigation, approach, descent on the island. The warning did not merely have to be correct in a general sense. It had to arrive before the attacking force did. Communications problems contributed to its failure to do so. The warning reached Hawaii too late. That single fact gives the episode its lasting force. The message represented a real attempt to alert the Hawaiian commanders, but it did not become timely warning. By the time it could have mattered most, the operational situation around Oahu had already changed. There is a temptation, looking backward, to imagine information moving instantly once danger is recognized. But the record of this morning shows a slower and more fragile process. The American system contained important pieces of knowledge. It also contained bottlenecks. Messages had to pass through institutions and technical means that were not designed for the speed at which the Pearl Harbor attack was unfolding. A warning generated from diplomatic intelligence had to cross an ocean and enter the command life of an island already under threat. The gap between knowledge and action was especially dangerous because the information itself was incomplete. The magic material pointed toward a diplomatic break. It did not reveal the detailed Japanese military plan. So even if a commander understood that war might begin at any moment, the form of that war remained uncertain. Would the blow fall in Southeast Asia? Against British or Dutch positions? Against American forces elsewhere in the Pacific? The late November warning had already created a broad sense of danger, but broad danger can be hard to translate into immediate local action without a named target. That uncertainty mattered in Hawaii. General Short's defensive posture had been shaped by the fear of sabotage, a concern that seemed plausible under the earlier warnings. Aircraft had been concentrated so they could be more easily guarded. The arrangement reflected one threat model. It did not prepare those aircraft well for a sudden air attack. Admiral Kimmel's fleet remained at Pearl Harbor, a powerful concentration of naval force inside a harbor that was both symbol and target. The morning message from Washington, had it arrived in time and been interpreted with the highest urgency, might have entered this fragile local setting. Instead, it became part of the evidence that warning existed somewhere in the system, without arriving soon enough to change the morning. Marshall's warning also reveals the limits of diplomatic intelligence when separated from tactical awareness. Magic could show that relations were breaking. It could not see the Japanese carriers. It could not hear engines north of Oahu. It could not report a submarine in the defensive sea area or a radar track approaching the island. Those signals belonged to other systems: naval patrol, harbor defense, radar reporting, local command interpretation. On December 7, each system held a fragment. None of the fragments reached the necessary conclusion in time. This was not a clean absence of warning. It was something more complex and more troubling. Washington had warning signs from diplomacy. Hawaii would soon have warning signs from the sea and from radar. The danger was not invisible. It was dispersed. It appeared in separate channels, each with its own delays, assumptions, and thresholds for action. In that sense, the warning authorized by General Marshall stands as one of the most revealing moments of the final morning. It shows senior concern. It shows an attempt to communicate that concern. It also shows how a warning can fail operationally without being false. The message was not wrong to be urgent. It was too late to be useful. By the time the warning made its way toward Hawaii, other events closer to Pearl Harbor were beginning to speak in a different language. These were not diplomatic signals or decoded messages. They were sightings, reports, and contacts near the harbor itself. Before sunrise, in the waters off the Pearl Harbor entrance, the first local sign of enemy action would come not from a code room in Washington, but from a lookout at sea, seeing what appeared to be a submarine periscope. By the time General Marshall's warning was moving toward Hawaii, through slow and imperfect channels, a different kind of warning was already forming much closer to Pearl Harbor. It did not come from a translation desk. It did not require diplomatic interpretation. It came from the dark water outside the harbor entrance, where ships on local duty were watching the approaches to the most important American naval base in the Pacific. Before sunrise on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the minesweeper USS Condor was operating near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. The harbor was not an open roadstead. It was a protected naval anchorage reached through defined approaches, with a channel leading inward toward the fleet's berths, Ford Island, and the moorings that included Battleship Row. Outside that entrance lay the waters that mattered most to local defense, the area where an enemy craft might try to observe, penetrate, or attack before anyone inside the harbor understood that a larger operation had begun. In those early morning hours, Condor reported what appeared to be a submarine periscope. The detail was small in physical size, but large in meaning. A periscope was not a vague diplomatic phrase or a general expectation that war might come somewhere in the Pacific. It was a local sighting near the mouth of Pearl Harbor in the hours before dawn. If accurate, it meant that an enemy submarine was already in the vicinity of the base. It meant that the crisis had crossed from warning into contact. The sighting also belonged to a defensive geography that was already recognized by the Navy, Cole, Zill. Pearl Harbor's approaches were part of a defensive sea area, a zone in which naval commanders treated unidentified or hostile underwater activity as a direct threat. The purpose of such an area was practical. It marked the waters where local defense had to act quickly, because the time between detection and danger could be very short. A submarine did not have to reach the open sea lanes to matter. Near the harbor entrance, even a small craft could threaten ships, observe movements, or attempt to slip through the channel. This was the setting in which Condor's report entered the morning. The harbor itself contained the visible weight of American naval power in the Pacific.
The approaches outside it were narrower, darker, and easier to misunderstand.
A ship's lookout had to distinguish shapes on moving water, in poor light, under the ordinary strain of night operations. Reports could be mistaken. Periscopes could be hard to confirm. And yet, in this case, the sighting aligned with a Japanese plan that American commanders did not yet see in full.
5 Imperial Japanese Navy midget submarines had been assigned to participate in the Pearl Harbor operation.
These were not fleet submarines in the ordinary sense. They were two-man craft, small enough to be carried and released for a special mission, and designed for stealth near a defended anchorage. Their presence added another layer to the Japanese attack plan. The main blow would come from the air, from carriers north of Oahu, but the operation also included these small submarines intended to approach Pearl Harbor from the sea. That combination is important. Pearl Harbor was not being approached by only one arm of Japanese naval power. While the carrier aircraft were still beyond the horizon, the midget submarines represented a separate tactical intrusion into the harbor defenses. They were part of the same operation, but they produced a different kind of warning. Aircraft would be seen later by radar and then by the eye. The midget submarines appeared first as something much more ambiguous, a possible periscope in darkness near the entrance channel. The Condor sighting therefore sits at the beginning of the local warnings on December 7th. It was not the first strategic clue that war was coming. That had already been present in the late November warnings, in the tense diplomatic traffic, and in the urgent morning message from Washington. But Condor's report was different. It was tied to a place, a time, and an object. Near Pearl Harbor, before sunrise, a submarine periscope. The difficulty was that military systems do not respond only to information. They respond to information judged through procedures, assumptions, and command channels. A single report, especially in darkness, had to be passed, weighed, and acted upon. The commanders and watch officers receiving it had to decide whether it was a false alarm, an uncertain sighting, or the first sign of an enemy attack. In the final hours before Pearl Harbor, that distinction mattered more than almost anything else. The defensive sea area existed because such distinctions could not always wait for perfect proof. A submarine in those waters was not merely an intelligence problem. It was a combat problem. But the larger American posture that morning was not yet one of active battle. The fleet at Pearl Harbor had not been placed under the kind of alarm that would have assumed an imminent air and sea attack on Oahu. The Army's air defense system was still immature. The Navy's harbor defense forces were alert in specific ways, but the island as a whole had not been shocked into wartime response. This is the central pattern of the morning. Warnings arrived in fragments. Each fragment made sense to the people closest to it, but the fragments did not immediately combine into a single picture. Washington saw a diplomatic rupture. A minesweeper saw what appeared to be a periscope. Soon, radar operators on the North Shore would see a large aircraft formation approaching from the north. Each signal was real in its own domain. Each required interpretation. And each moved through a system that had not been organized to recognize them as pieces of the same event. For Condor, the sighting was a local naval matter. For Pearl Harbor's defenders, the area outside the entrance was a place where caution and speed had to meet. The waters there formed the threshold between the open Pacific and the anchored fleet. A hostile submarine near that threshold would not need to know every detail of the harbor to create danger. It only had to be close enough, at the right time, while the defenders were still deciding what the sighting meant. The Japanese midget submarine assignment shows that the Periscope report was not an isolated curiosity. The small submarines were part of the same operational design that had brought the Kido Butai across the northern Pacific. Their mission did not replace the carrier's strike. It accompanied it. The aircraft would deliver the destructive power that made the attack historic. But the midget submarines reveal how thoroughly the Japanese plan had considered Pearl Harbor as a defended naval target, not merely as a point on a map. The attack was to involve air crews, carriers, torpedoes modified for shallow water, and small undersea craft sent toward the harbor itself. From the American side, the sighting exposed the gap between a guarded base and a fully alerted one. Pearl Harbor had defenses. It had patrols.
It had ships assigned to local duties.
It had a recognized defensive sea area. But defense is not the same as readiness for a specific attack at a specific hour. A report can enter the system and still not transform the posture of an entire command. That is what makes the Condor episode so revealing. It was a warning close enough to touch, yet still not enough by itself to change the morning before the decisive minutes arrived. The quietness of the scene should not obscure its significance. A minesweeper in dark water, a lookout's observation, a reported periscope near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. These were the first tactical signs that the war had reached Oahu. They came before the dive bombers and torpedo planes were overhead. They came before explosions rolled across Ford Island and Battleship Row. They came before the radar report from Opana would be misunderstood as something harmless. The first local warning was not in the sky. It was at sea. And once that report existed, the burden shifted to the ships charged with guarding the approaches. Among them was USS Ward, a destroyer operating under the command of Lieutenant Commander William W. West. Outerbridge. In the same defensive waters where Condor had seen the suspected periscope, Ward would soon move from warning to action. The morning was still dark, and the air attack had not yet begun. But in the sea outside Pearl Harbor, the first shots of the day were drawing near. The periscope report from USS Condor did not end the matter. It moved the morning into a different state. Somewhere outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, in waters already defined as a defensive sea area, a possible submarine had been seen. The sighting was brief, but the implication was large. If a submarine was trying to enter or operate near the harbor, then the threat was no longer only a question of distant diplomatic rupture or broad Pacific tension. It was local. It was physical. It was in the water off Oahu. USS Ward was one of the ships assigned to guard that space. Ward was an old destroyer, known formally as USS Ward, DD-139, and on the morning of December 7, 1941, she was commanded by Lieutenant Commander William W. Outerbridge. Outerbridge had only recently taken command, but the situation allowed little time for ceremony or adjustment. A destroyer on patrol near the approaches to Pearl Harbor had a practical duty: investigate, identify, and if necessary, act against any hostile craft inside the defensive zone. That defensive sea area mattered. It was not simply open ocean. It was a guarded approach to one of the most important American naval bases in the Pacific. Inside Pearl Harbor lay the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet, the docks, the channels, Ford Island, and the moorings along Battleship Row. Outside the harbor entrance, the sea was part of the shield around all of that. A submarine contact there could not be treated as an abstract possibility. The Japanese plan for Pearl Harbor included more than the carrier aircraft that were, at that same time, moving toward Oahu from the north. 5 Imperial Japanese Navy, 2-man midget submarines, had been assigned to participate in the operation. They were small craft, operating in the shadow of a much larger attack plan. Their role has often been overshadowed by the air assault because the dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters caused the visible devastation of the morning. But before the first wave appeared over the island, the midget submarines created one of the clearest local warnings that enemy action had already begun. Ward became the ship that turned that warning into combat. In the early morning, after the earlier periscope sighting, Ward encountered a submarine operating near the harbor entrance. The target was not a fleet submarine cruising in deep water. It was a small craft, consistent with the midget submarines Japan had sent as part of the Pearl Harbor operation. For the men aboard Ward, the encounter demanded a decision. The air was not yet filled with aircraft. The harbor had not yet exploded into battle. But a submarine was present where it did not belong. Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge acted dangerous. Ward opened fire with her 4-inch gun. The destroyer also used depth charges, the standard weapon for attacking a submerged or partly submerged submarine contact. The scene was compressed and direct. A destroyer on local patrol, a small submarine in the defensive sea area, gunfire across the water, then explosive charges thrown into the sea to finish the attack. This was not a drill or a distant report. It was live action against an enemy vessel before the larger attack had begun. Ward's report became one of the key documents of the morning. The ship reported that it had attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in the defensive sea area. Those words are important because they show the strength of the claim. Ward was not merely reporting a suspicion. It was reporting an engagement. It had seen a submarine, fired on it, and attacked it with depth charges. The report went to the 14th Naval District, the command structure responsible for naval matters in Hawaii. In another context, such a report might have cut through uncertainty at once. A United States destroyer had opened fire near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. A submarine had been attacked inside a defensive area. War, in the local tactical sense, had already begun. But the larger system did not respond with the speed the moment required. This is one of the central patterns of the final 24 hours before Pearl Harbor. Information existed, but information alone did not become effective warning. A message could be accurate and still fail to produce action in time. A sighting could be real and still be treated as uncertain. A report could be urgent and still move through channels more slowly than events on the ground, in the air, or at sea. Ward's engagement belongs beside the other missed or delayed signals of that morning. In Washington, the Japanese diplomatic break had been read as a sign of imminent danger, but it did not name Pearl Harbor as the target. General George C. Marshall's warning was authorized, but communications problems contributed to its late arrival. Near the harbor, Condor's Periscope sighting suggested that the enemy was close, but it was still a report requiring confirmation. Ward supplied that confirmation in the form of gunfire and depth charges. Yet even this did not produce an island-wide or fleet-wide alert in time to prevent surprise from the air. The significance of Ward's action also grew clearer long after the battle. For decades, the encounter stood in the historical record as one of the first combat actions of the day, supported by the ship's report and by testimony about what the crew had seen and done. Then, in 2002, the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory discovered the wreck of a Japanese midget submarine. That discovery strengthened the historical record of Ward's encounter. It gave later investigators physical evidence consistent with the old report. A Japanese midget submarine had been present in those waters, and Ward's attack had not been an imagined alarm. That later discovery matters because Pearl Harbor has always carried questions about warning, interpretation, and responsibility. Some signals before the attack were broad. Some were ambiguous. Some were buried in code rooms or delayed in communications channels. Ward's encounter was different. It was a destroyer engaging a submarine in the waters outside the base. It was concrete. It was tactical. It was close. And still, it was not enough. The reason is not that Ward failed to act. Ward did act. Outerbridge made the decision to fire Neithan. The crew used the weapons available to them. The ship sent its report. The failure lay in the gap between an individual unit's action and the larger defensive reaction that might have followed. Pearl Harbor's defense depended not only on ships, guns, aircraft, and radar sets, but on the ability to interpret signals quickly and connect them across commands. On the morning of December 7th, that connection was too slow. This is why Ward's story is not merely an opening shot story. It is not only the dramatic fact that an American destroyer fired before the air raid began. It is part of the deeper structure of the day. The United States had warnings at several levels, but those warnings did not merge into a single clear picture in time. The submarine contact belonged to the sea approaches. The later radar contact would belong to the northern sky. The diplomatic traffic belonged to Washington and PI. Each was real in its own domain. Each required interpretation. Each needed to move through people and procedures before it could become action. At Pearl Harbor, the clocks were unforgiving. The Japanese carrier force had already launched its first wave from north of Oahu at about 6 in the morning. Those aircraft were crossing the distance toward the island, while Ward was making her report. The submarine fight near the harbor entrance and the approaching air formation were not separate stories in reality. They were parts of the same operation. But to the defenders, they appeared as fragments, a periscope, a submarine report, a warning delayed from Washington, and soon, a signal on a radar screen.
The first shots had been fired at sea.
The first confirmed local combat action had taken place before the bombs fell. A Japanese midget submarine had been attacked in the defensive waters outside Pearl Harbor. Yet the island did not fully awaken to the scale of what was coming. While Ward's report moved through naval channels, another warning system was operating on Oahu, still new, still imperfectly integrated, and still not fully trusted as a command instrument. On the North Shore, near Kahuku Point, an Army mobile SCR-270 radar set was in use at Opana. There, Privates Joseph L. Lockard and George E. Elliott Jr. were watching a technology that could see beyond human eyesight. The next signal would not rise from the sea. It would appear as a large contact coming in from the north. While Ward's report moved through naval channels, another warning system was already turning on the high ground of Oahu's North Shore. It did not belong to the Navy. It did not watch the harbor entrance, or the defensive sea area, or the dark water where a midget submarine had just been attacked. It belonged to the Army, and it watched the air. At Opana, just inland from the coast near Kahuku Point, an Army mobile SCR-270 radar set stood in the early morning light. This was not yet the polished, integrated air defense network that later generations would associate with radar. In December 1941, it was still new, still being learned, and still uncertain in its place inside the command system. It could reach far beyond the sight of any lookout. But the ability to detect was only the first part of warning. The harder question was what the system would do with what it saw. The set at Opana was part of the Army's early warning radar effort on Oahu. These SCR-270 units were mobile radar sets, truck-mounted, and intended to detect aircraft at long range. In technical terms, they represented a major step forward. They gave Army operators a way to sense approaching aircraft before the aircraft could be heard or seen. On an island such as Oahu, where distance and direction mattered intensely, that was no small capability. The ocean could hide a carrier force. Clouds, darkness, and curvature of the earth could hide aircraft from human eyes. Radar offered a different kind of perception. But in the final hours before Pearl Harbor, perception was not enough. The air warning system in Hawaii was immature. The equipment existed. Training was underway. Operators were gaining experience. But the system that had to connect radar stations, telephone reports, plotting centers, duty officers, aircraft identification, and command decisions was still incomplete as an instrument of war. A radar set could produce a contact. A trained operator could recognize that something large was out there. Yet that contact still had to be reported, received, interpreted, believed, and acted upon. Each step carried the possibility of delay or error. That is why Opana matters. The story of radar before the Pearl Harbor attack is not a story of a machine failing to work. It is closer to the opposite. The machine worked well enough to see what human beings could not. The failure lay in the thin human and institutional structure around it. The warning system had not yet been fully hardened by practice, routine, and command urgency. It had not yet become a reflex. It was still, in important ways, experimental. At Opana that morning were two Army privates, Joseph L. Lockard and George E. Elliott Jr. Their names would become inseparable from the radar episode because they were the operators present when the critical signal appeared. They were not senior commanders. They were not sitting in a war room in Washington. They were not part of the Navy's submarine response near Pearl Harbor. They were young enlisted men at a remote radar site on the North Shore, looking at an instrument that represented one of the newest layers of island defense. The location itself mattered. Opana sat on the northern side of Oahu, near Kahuku Point, facing the broad Pacific approach from which the Japanese first wave was coming. The Japanese carrier strike force had approached from the north, using rough winter seas and less traveled waters to reduce the chance of discovery. That northern approach had helped keep the carriers hidden, but it also placed the incoming aircraft on a path that could be seen by a radar set looking outward from the North Shore. In that sense, Opana was positioned at the edge of the island's awareness. Pearl Harbor lay to the south, protected by channels, patrols, and local defenses. The Army airfields were scattered across Oahu. The fleet was anchored in the harbor. But the first indication of the air attack, if it came by radar, would not necessarily appear where the ships were. It would appear out beyond the coastline, in the invisible distance between the island and the carriers. The SCR-270 did not show a picture in the modern sense. It did not present a clear map with labeled aircraft, friendly or enemy. It produced information that operators had to read and translate into direction, range, and significance. A radar echo could reveal that something was there, and sometimes that it was large. It could not, by itself, explain intent. It could not identify nationality. It could not say whether the contact represented American aircraft, Japanese aircraft, or something else without human interpretation and supporting information. This distinction is central to the last day before Pearl Harbor. Again and again, warnings existed in partial form. A diplomatic break suggested danger, but not the target. A submarine report suggested enemy action, but had to move through naval channels. A radar contact could show aircraft approaching, but not automatically turn into an island-wide alert. Each warning required a system strong enough to complete the chain from fact to decision. At Opana, the chain began with trained eyes and a new machine. Lockard and Elliott were part of a developing air warning practice on Oahu. Their work depended not only on operating the set, but on passing reports to the information center at Fort Shafter. Fort Shafter was the place where radar information could be received and interpreted within the Army's air warning structure. It was supposed to be the point where distant contacts became usable information for command. But the system was still young, and on a Sunday morning in December 1941, it was not operating with the full urgency of an island expecting immediate air attack. This was the quiet contradiction of the radar story. The United States Army in Hawaii had a technology capable of detecting aircraft far from Oahu. Yet the organization around that technology had not matured to the point where a single report would automatically carry decisive force. The radar operators could see outward. The information center could receive a call. But between detection and action stood assumptions, staffing, procedures, and the ordinary habits of a system not yet at war. The men at Opana were also operating within the larger alert posture shaped by earlier decisions in military command. General Walter C. Short's concern in the days before the attack had centered heavily on sabotage. That focus affected Army preparations across the island, including how aircraft were guarded and arranged on the ground. Radar belonged to a different threat model. It mattered most if the danger was an air raid from beyond the horizon. But the dominant defensive posture had not been built around the expectation that carrier aircraft were already on their way. So the radar set on the North Shore sat at the meeting point of two worlds. One world was technological and forward-looking, long-range detection, air warning, instruments that could extend the senses of a defended island. The other world was procedural and uncertain, limited training, an immature reporting system, and commanders who had broad warnings of war, but no confirmed warning that Pearl Harbor itself was about to be attacked from the air. For Lockard and Elliott, the morning began as duty. The set had to be operated, watched, and understood. The coastline near Kahuku Point looked out over open water. Beyond that water, hidden by distance, the Japanese first wave was moving toward Oahu after launching from carriers north of the island. The men at Opana did not know that. Their instrument could not tell them the story behind the echo. It could only show that something was there. That limitation does not make the radar episode less important. It makes it more revealing. The Opana station demonstrates how close the defenders came to a usable tactical warning and how fragile such a warning could be when it entered an unready system. The signal would not be a rumor. It would not be a vague, diplomatic inference. It would be a detected mass of aircraft approaching from the north. But before that signal could matter, it had to pass from the screen to the operators to a telephone call to Fort Shafter, and then into the mind of the officer who received it. At Opana, the equipment was awake. The operators were watching. The North Shore was quiet, but the sky beyond it was not empty. Soon, the new machine would show Lockard and Elliott a contact of unusual size far out over the ocean, coming toward Oahu from the north. The machine at Opana did what it had been built to do. It looked beyond the visible horizon and gave warning that something large was moving through the air north of Oahu. At 7:02 on the morning of December 7, 1941, Privates Joseph L. Lockard and George E. Elliott Jr. saw an unusually large contact on the screen of their SCR-270 radar set. The station was at Opana, on the north shore of Oahu, just inland from the coast near Kahuku Point. The contact appeared far out over the ocean, about 137 miles north of the island. That distance mattered. Human observers on the ground could not have seen the formation. Men at the harbor could not have heard it. Pilots on airfields across Oahu were not yet reacting to anything in the sky. But at Opana, the radar set showed a return large enough to draw attention immediately. Lockard and Elliott were not watching a single aircraft. They were seeing what the radar presented as a mass. The National Park Service chronology identifies this contact as the first Japanese attack wave, then approaching Oahu from the north after launching earlier that morning from the carrier force at sea. To the men at Opana, however, the screen did not label the contact as Japanese. It did not identify aircraft type. It did not say torpedo bombers, dive bombers, level bombers, or fighters. It did not say attack. It only showed that a large formation was there. The distinction is central to the entire morning. Radar produced a real warning, but it was a warning in technical form. It required interpretation. It required a reporting chain. It required a staffed and alert information center that could connect an unexplained formation with the broader crisis already unfolding in fragments around Oahu. By 7:02, other warning signs already existed elsewhere. In the defensive sea area, outside Pearl Harbor, USS Ward had attacked a Japanese midget submarine and reported the action through naval channels. But the radar operators at Opana were part of a different system, the Army's Air Warning Network. Their equipment watched the approaches by air, not the harbor entrance by sea. The morning signals were not combining into one picture. They were moving through separate channels, each with its own delays, assumptions, and limits. At Opana, Lockard and Elliott continued watching the contact. The size of the return was unusual enough that Elliott placed a call to the information center at Fort Shafter. The time was 7:06. The call itself was a small act, but in the history of the morning, it became one of the most important communications before the attack. A radar station on the north shore had detected a large formation far north of Oahu. One of its operators had reported it to the Army Information Center. The information was no longer only on the screen. It had entered the command system. But entering the system was not the same as changing the system. Fort Shafter was the receiving point for the report. It was where the radar contact should have become part of an organized air defense picture. That was the purpose of an information center, to take scattered observations, sort them, compare them, and help determine whether an air threat existed. In a mature system, such a report would have been tested against known friendly flights, expected arrivals, patrol information, and the current alert posture of the island. In Hawaii in December 1941, that system was still immature. The radar sets were new. The procedures were still developing. The connection between detection and action was not yet strong enough to guarantee a response. The Opana episode is therefore not a story of equipment failure. It is almost the opposite. The equipment worked. The operators saw the contact. Elliott called it in. The failure lay in the space between a correct technical signal and the command decision that should have followed. The radar track continued after the call. From 7:02 onward, Lockard and Elliott followed the large formation as it came closer to Oahu. The contact was not a momentary flash. It was not a fleeting mark that vanished before anyone could judge it. It remained visible long enough to be observed, reported, and tracked. For more than 40 minutes, the approaching aircraft were inside the reach of American radar. This is why the Opana detection carries such weight. It shows that the attackers were not invisible in the literal sense. The Japanese carrier force had crossed the northern Pacific without being found at sea, and the first wave had launched from carriers north of Oahu. But once the aircraft were in the air and closing on the island, they did appear on an American warning device. The new technology cut through distance and morning haze. It gave the defenders a measure of time. Time, however, had to be converted into alert. That conversion did not happen at Opana.
Lockhart and Elliot could report what they saw, but they could not order fighters into the air.
They could not sound a harbor-wide alarm. They could not change the readiness condition of the Pacific Fleet, or disperse aircraft that had been concentrated against sabotage, or warn every airfield on Oahu that a large formation was approaching from the north. They were enlisted operators at a remote radar site, handling a new technology within a command structure, still learning how to use it. The aircraft continued inbound. At 7:45, radar contact was lost. By then, the formation had approached closer to Oahu. The loss of contact did not mean the danger had passed. It meant the radar station no longer held the target on its screen. The warning had run its course as a radar track. Between 7:02 and 7:45, the warning had existed in its clearest technical form. A large contact had appeared at long range. It had been observed by trained operators. It had been reported by telephone to Fort Shafter. It had been tracked for a significant period as it moved toward the island. The record is stark because each part of the sequence can be stated plainly. Opana detected the formation at 7:02. Elliot called the Fort Shafter Information Center at 7:06. The radar operators continued to track the contact until 7:45. The formation was about 137 miles north of Oahu when first detected. The aircraft were, in fact, the first wave of the Japanese attack. Those facts do not require exaggeration. They are powerful because they are restrained. They reveal a warning that was accurate but not understood in time. There is a temptation, looking backward, to imagine that the radar screen should have spoken for itself. A large, unidentified formation north of Oahu on a tense Sunday morning seems, from the distance of history, to demand immediate alarm. But the men inside the system did not have the full pattern that later investigators and historians would reconstruct. They had pieces: diplomatic tension, late November warnings, concerns about sabotage, an immature radar network, a submarine report at sea, and now an unexplained air contact. The tragedy lies partly in the fact that the pieces were real, but they did not lock together before the attack began. The Opana contact also exposes a deeper problem in warning systems. Detection is only the first step. A signal must be trusted. It must be carried to the right place. It must be interpreted against the right assumptions. Then it must produce action quickly enough to matter. At Pearl Harbor, the radar signal passed the first tests. It was detected. It was reported. It was tracked. But the interpretation that followed would drain the warning of its urgency. At Fort Shafter, the call reached an information center that was not prepared to treat the contact as the leading edge of an enemy strike. The large return would be explained in a way that seemed plausible inside the local circumstances of the morning. Expected American B-17 bombers were due from the mainland. A new officer, Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, would connect the report to that expectation. The radar had shown aircraft approaching from the north. The operators had done enough to place the warning into the system, but once the report left Opana, it entered a room where the crucial question was no longer what the machine had seen. It was what the contact was believed to mean. The report from Opana did not fail because it vanished. It reached the Army Information Center at Fort Shafter. It arrived by telephone. It carried the essential facts that Privates Joseph L. Lockhart and George E. Elliot Jr. had seen: a large radar contact, far north of Oahu, moving toward the island. The signal had crossed the first distance from a remote radar site on the north shore to the command system that was supposed to make sense of it. That is what makes this moment so important. The warning was not only a question of technology. The SCR-270 radar set had done its work. The operators had noticed the unusual return. Elliot had made the call. Lockhart and Elliot continued to follow the contact until it was lost at 7:45 VP. The failure came at the next step, where information had to become judgment. At Fort Shafter, the report reached an information center that was part of an air warning system, still in an immature state. Radar existed on Oahu, but the procedures around radar were not yet strong enough to carry the full weight of an approaching attack. The equipment could detect aircraft beyond ordinary sight, but detection alone was not the same as identification. A radar return did not speak for itself. It had to be fitted into an explanation. On the morning of December 7, 1941, that explanation was provided by Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler. He was the officer at the Fort Shafter Information Center when the Opana call came in. Tyler was new in that role, and the system around him was not a hardened wartime network of trained identification specialists, fully staffed stations, and practiced emergency procedures. It was a developing arrangement, using a new technology, on a Sunday morning in a command environment shaped by assumptions made before the first bombs fell. The contact Lockhart and Elliott reported was large. That fact might have been alarming. But in the information center, it could also be made to fit a different known fact. American B-17 bombers were expected to arrive from the mainland. This expectation gave Tyler a plausible explanation for what Opana had seen. If a group of American aircraft was due in the area, then a large radar contact approaching Oahu did not necessarily mean an enemy force. It could be the expected movement of friendly planes. This was the fatal gap between detection and interpretation. The same piece of evidence can point in different directions depending on the frame placed around it. To the radar operators, the contact was unusual because of its size and position. To the officer receiving the report, it could be understood as a known arrival. The radar did not identify the aircraft as Japanese. It did not name the carriers that had launched them. It did not reveal Commander Mitsuo Fuchida leading the first wave. It produced a contact, and human beings had to decide what that contact meant. The wrong explanation was not a mechanical failure. It was a human and institutional one. The Army had an early warning technology capable of seeing a massive aircraft long before the first wave reached Oahu. But the warning chain required more than sight. It required a ready information center, trained interpretation, rapid escalation, and a willingness to treat the unexplained as dangerous until proved otherwise. On that morning, the report was absorbed into a peaceful explanation. This is one of the hard lessons of the Pearl Harbor story. Warning is not simply the arrival of information. It is the acceptance of information as meaningful in time to act. The Opana radar episode shows that accurate information can be neutralized without being ignored in the simplest sense. It can be received, considered, and then placed under the wrong label. Once that happens, urgency drains away. The assumption about the B-17 bombers mattered because it made the report ordinary. A large group of aircraft arriving from the northeast or north could be understood as part of expected American movement rather than the leading edge of a Japanese carrier strike. Inside that assumption, there was no need to sound a general alarm across Oahu. There was no need to warn the airfields that enemy planes might be minutes away. There was no need to connect this radar contact with the submarine reports moving through naval channels near Pearl Harbor's entrance. The contact had been explained. And yet, in the sky north of Oahu, the explanation was wrong. The aircraft detected by Opana were not American B-17 bombers from the mainland. They were the first wave of the Japanese attack force, launched that morning from carriers north of the island. The Japanese carrier strike force had approached by a northern route across rough, less-traveled winter seas. Its aircraft were now closing the final distance to the targets on Oahu, Pearl Harbor, Ford Island, Battleship Row, and the airfields that protected the fleet. The information center at Fort Shafter did not see that whole picture. No one in that room had before them a complete map linking the Japanese carriers, the launch at about 6 in the morning, the Opana contact at 7:02, and the expected time of arrival over the island. The tragedy lies partly in that separation. Different pieces of the morning existed in different places. At sea, USS Ward had already attacked a midget submarine in the defensive sea area. At Opana, radar operators had tracked a large air contact. In Washington, diplomatic intelligence had shown a rupture with Japan was near, but not the operational plan for Pearl Harbor. These were not joined into a single warning in time. Fort Shafter became the place where one of those pieces lost its force. The report did not have to be destroyed for the warning to fail. It only had to be interpreted as something harmless. The expected B-17 arrival created a mental path away from danger. Once Tyler made that connection, the radar contact no longer demanded emergency action in the system as it existed that morning. It is important not to make the episode larger than the record allows. The documented point is clear enough without adding imagined conversations or hidden certainty. The Opana station reported a large contact. The report reached the Fort Shafter Information Center. Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler interpreted it as likely being the expected American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. The contact was, in fact, the incoming first wave of Japanese aircraft. That is the core of the episode, and it is enough. Enough, because it shows how surprise can survive even after warning has appeared. Pearl Harbor was not blind in the final hour. A machine saw the aircraft. Two operators understood that the return was unusual.
A telephone call carried the information to the proper center.
But the system did not convert that knowledge into an alarm. Between the radar screen and the island's defenses stood interpretation, and interpretation failed. By 7:45, Opana had lost contact as the aircraft came closer to Oahu. Minutes remained before the attack began. The warning from the north had passed through the Army's new radar network and had been softened into a benign explanation. At Fort Shafter, the large return had been made to fit the expectation of friendly bombers. In the air, however, the first wave was still coming on, carrying the actual meaning of the radar contact toward Pearl Harbor. By 7:45, the last useful minutes were disappearing. The radar contact that had appeared north of Oahu had been tracked, reported, and then explained away. It had not been ignored in the simplest sense. It had been fitted into the wrong story. Now the aircraft themselves were about to supply the correction. The first wave had launched from the Japanese carriers north of Oahu at about 6 o'clock that morning. The force belonged to the Kido Butai, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force, built around Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku. Its approach had carried it across the northern Pacific by a route chosen for concealment, cold water, rough winter weather, and less traveled seas. The aircraft now closing on Oahu were not the expected American B-17 bombers from the mainland. They were Japanese carrier planes, led in the first assault wave by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. The earlier signals now belonged to the same chain. The broad war warnings from Washington had told senior American commanders that conflict with Japan might be near, but they had not named Pearl Harbor as the point of attack. Magic had shown a diplomatic rupture approaching, but it had not revealed the carrier force or the target. USS Condor had reported a periscope near the harbor entrance. USS Ward had fired on and dropped depth charges against a Japanese midget submarine in the defensive sea area. At Opana, Privates Joseph L. Lockard and George E. Elliott Jr. had seen a large formation about 137 miles north of Oahu. At Fort Shafter, Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler had interpreted that formation as likely friendly. Each signal had been real in its own frame. None had become a timely, island-wide alarm. At about 7:55, the question ended. The first Japanese attack wave struck Oahu. For the men at Pearl Harbor and at the surrounding airfields, the morning changed with stunning speed. The attack did not arrive as a single event at one point on the island. It opened across a military landscape that had been described earlier in this episode: the harbor, Ford Island, Battleship Row, and the airfields that supported Army, Navy, and Marine aviation. The Japanese plan depended on simultaneity and shock. It sought to cripple ships in harbor and aircraft on the ground before American defenses could organize. Inside Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row was the central image and one of the central targets. The American battle line lay along the southeastern side of Ford Island, where the Pacific Fleet's battleships were moored. In the logic of naval warfare in 1941, battleships still carried immense symbolic and military weight. To strike them at anchor was to strike not only metal and machinery, but also the visible strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. The attacking aircraft included the types prepared for this operation in the months before the strike. Nakajima Kate aircraft served as torpedo bombers and level bombers. Aichi-Val dive bombers attacked from above. Mitsubishi Zero fighters swept in to suppress air defenses and strike aircraft on the ground. The technical problem of Pearl Harbor's shallow water had already been solved by Japanese planners through modified aerial torpedoes, including wooden fins and altered arming devices. Those modifications mattered now because the harbor's average depth, about 45 feet, had once seemed to reduce the danger from torpedo attack. On this morning, the Assumption no longer protected the ships. Ford Island became a focal point because of where it sat, in the middle of Pearl Harbor, ringed by naval installations and ship moorings. The air station there was struck as part of the broader effort to destroy American air power before it could respond. The same logic extended outward to the island's airfields. Wheeler, Hickam, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe were all hit during the attack. These names were not incidental targets scattered across a map. They were part of the system that might have launched fighters, patrol planes, or other aircraft against the attackers if warning had become action in time. At Wheeler Field, Army aircraft had been concentrated under the sabotage alert posture that Lieutenant General Walter C. Short had adopted after the late November warnings. That decision had been made under one threat model: the danger that saboteurs might damage aircraft if they were dispersed and harder to guard. In that context, grouping aircraft had an internal logic. But against carrier aircraft arriving in daylight, it created a different vulnerability. Planes gathered together could be attacked together. What had been a protective arrangement against one danger became a liability against another. That is one of the hard lessons of this hour. The failure was not simply that commanders had done nothing. It was that actions taken against the expected threat made the force less ready for the threat that actually arrived. The sabotage lens did not invent the Japanese attack, and it did not make the aircraft come. But it shaped the ground, pictured the attackers found when they reached Oahu. At Hickam Field, near Pearl Harbor, the attack joined the destruction of air power to the attack on the fleet. Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe were also struck. The Japanese first wave was not only aiming at ships, it was also trying to prevent pursuit and resistance. If American aircraft remained on the ground, damaged or destroyed, the carrier force's withdrawal would be safer. The success of Surprise depended not only on the first bombs and torpedoes, but on paralyzing the defenders during the opening minutes. From the Japanese side, the attack represented the end of a long, disciplined approach. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been the architect of the broader attack concept. Commander Minoru Genda had been associated with planning the carrier aircraft operation. Nagumo's carriers had crossed the northern Pacific in secrecy. Fuchida's first wave now translated that planning into impact. The geographic concealment, the technical modifications, the trained aircrews, and the timing all converged over Oahu. From the American side, the same minutes exposed the gap between information and readiness. The island had not lacked all warnings. It had lacked a completed warning process. A diplomatic warning in Washington had not become tactical knowledge in Hawaii. A submarine attack report had not become a general alarm before the air raid. A radar detection had not become an interception. The first wave arrived through that space. The Opana radar contact, lost at 7:45, had been only minutes ahead of the attack. In retrospect, those minutes appear unbearably clear. But the historical point is not simply to say that someone should have known. It is to see how each institution held only part of the picture. The Navy had the harbor defense report from Ward. The Army had the radar track. Washington had diplomatic intelligence and a late warning authorized by General George C. Marshall. The commanders in Hawaii had broad notice of danger, but no confirmed message that a carrier air raid was inbound. The tragedy was in the failure to connect the parts quickly enough. Once the aircraft were overhead, interpretation no longer mattered. The sound and violence of the attack forced the meaning that had been missed. Battleship Row, Ford Island, and the airfields became the evidence. The first wave had arrived from the north, just as the radar had indicated. The large contact had not been friendly. It had been the leading edge of a coordinated attack against the United States military presence on Oahu. A second wave would follow after a short interval, adding to the damage already begun. But the decisive fact of Surprise belonged to the opening strike. By the time the defenders understood fully what was happening, the Japanese operation had achieved the central advantage it needed. Ships were under attack in the harbor.
Aircraft had been hit on the ground. The warning system had been overtaken by events. The morning of December 7, 1941, would leave behind wreckage, casualties, investigations, and arguments over responsibility.
All 8 United States battleships present in Pearl Harbor would be sunk or damaged. Aircraft losses would be severe. The American carriers, among Japan's key targets, would not be in the harbor. Those facts belong to the aftermath, but their origins run back through the final hours before the first bombs fell. The first wave did not come out of nowhere. It came through warnings that remained separate, reports that moved too slowly, assumptions that seemed reasonable until the moment they failed, and a sky that radar had already searched into day. By the time Commander Mitsuo F. Fuchida's aircraft reached Oahu, the missed signals had gathered into a single result.
Surprise had survived all the way to impact.
The warning system had been overtaken by events.
What remained after the aircraft passed and the smoke settled over Oahu was the scale of the result.
Pearl Harbor had not been merely startled. It had been struck at the center of American naval power in the Pacific.
The harbor that had held the Pacific Fleet since April 1940 had become, in less than a morning, a place of burning oil, wrecked steel, shattered aircraft, and sudden loss. Battleship Row, Ford Island, and the surrounding airfields were no longer names on a military map.
They were evidence.
The cost was heavy in American lives. Sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, and civilians were caught in an attack that arrived before the island had reached a state of full readiness.
The damage was not confined to ships.
Aircraft on Oahu, many of them positioned under the sabotage precautions that had shaped Army defenses, were struck on the ground. Airfields including Wheeler, Hickam, Iwa, Bellows, and Kaneohe had been hit as part of the Japanese plan to reduce American air resistance and protect the attacking force during its withdrawal.
Inside Pearl Harbor, the most visible damage was to the battleships.
All 8 United States battleships present in the harbor were sunk or damaged. That single fact carried enormous symbolic weight. These ships represented the older measure of naval power, heavy armor, big guns, visible national strength.
Japan's attack did not destroy every American naval asset in the Pacific, but it did something close to what its planners had intended in the immediate sense.
It crippled the battle line at the opening of war.
And yet the result contained a contradiction that would matter greatly afterward. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. They had been among Japan's key targets because the attack itself had demonstrated the reach and destructive power of carrier aviation. The Japanese striking force, the Kido Butai, had come across the northern Pacific, built around 6 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Ziakaku, and Shokaku. From those decks had come the aircraft that made battleships vulnerable in a way that older assumptions had not fully absorbed.
But the American carriers were absent from the harbor when the attack came.
That absence did not lessen the shock of the day. It did not reverse the casualties or erase the damage to the Pacific Fleet.
But it did mean that Japan had failed to destroy part of what would become essential to the coming war. The same weapon system that had delivered surprise to Oahu would become central to the conflict that followed.
In the quiet arithmetic of aftermath, devastation and survival stood side by side.
For Admiral Husband E.
Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Duss. Short, the attack would also become a question of command responsibility. They had received broad warnings. They had not received a confirmed warning that Pearl Harbor itself would be attacked by carrier aircraft.
Their decisions in the final days were made inside that gap.
Kimmel commanded the United States Pacific Fleet.
Short commanded Army forces in Hawaii. Each had to interpret messages from Washington, local conditions, and the threat environment as they understood it. The late November messages had warned of possible Japanese action.
The naval message of November 27 had even described itself as a war warning. But the warning pointed toward an imminent Pacific crisis, not a precise strike on Oahu. Short's response had centered heavily on sabotage. Under that lens, grouping aircraft made them easier to guard. Under the reality that arrived on December 7, It made them easier to attack. This was the hard problem that later inquiries would return to again and again. The issue was not whether every warning was absent. It was whether warning, once present, had been understood, distributed, and acted upon in time in white. The record of the final 24 hours shows repeated moments when information entered the system but did not produce an effective response. The minesweeper USS Condor saw a submarine periscope near the Pearl Harbor entrance. USS Ward, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William W. Outerbridge, attacked and sank a Japanese midget submarine in the defensive sea area before the air attack began. Ward reported that it had attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating there. Decades later, the discovery of a Japanese midget submarine wreck by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory in 2002 would support the historical record of that encounter. The warning had been real, but it did not become an island-wide or fleet-wide alert in time. At Opana radar site, near Kahuku Point on Oahu's north shore, privates Joseph L. N. Lockard and George E. Elliott Jr. saw the incoming first wave on an SCR-270 early warning radar set. The contact appeared at 7:02 in the morning, about 137 miles north of Oahu. Elliott called the Fort Shafter Information Center at 7:06. The radar track continued until 7:45, but Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler interpreted the large contact as likely the expected American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. The machine had detected the approach. The human system gave it the wrong meaning. In Washington, magic had provided access to Japanese diplomatic messages. The 14-part message processed on December 6 and December 7 signaled a rupture in relations, but it did not reveal the detailed military plan for Pearl Harbor. General George C. Marshall authorized a warning on the morning of December 7, yet communications problems contributed to its reaching Hawaii too late. Again, the pattern repeated. Concern existed somewhere in the system, but it did not arrive as timely operational warning. After the war, Congress created the Joint Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor Attack. Its hearings ran from November 15, 1945 to May 31, 1946. By then, the war that had begun for the United States at Pearl Harbor had ended. The committee looked backward across a changed world through testimony, documents, messages, command decisions, and the memory of a morning that had become national trauma. The investigation did not remove the central tension. It sharpened it. Pearl Harbor was called a surprise attack, and in the tactical sense it was. The aircraft arrived over Oahu before the defenders were ready to meet them. But it was not an event without warning signs. There had been strategic warnings from Washington, diplomatic intelligence pointing toward crisis, a submarine contact outside the harbor, a destroyer attack in the defensive sea area, and radar detection of aircraft coming from the north. The unresolved lesson lies in the distance between those two truths. Warning existed. Surprise still occurred. That is why the final 24 hours remained so difficult to reduce to a single failure. No one signal contained the whole attack. Magic did not reveal the carrier force. The November war warning did not name Pearl Harbor as the target. Ward's submarine report did not, by itself, describe incoming aircraft. Opana's radar did not identify the planes as Japanese. Each piece required interpretation. Each piece needed a system prepared to connect it with the others under pressure. The Japanese operation exploited that weakness. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force had taken the northern route through rough, less traveled seas. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's first wave reached Oahu after the defenders had received fragments of truth but had not assembled them into action. The result was not silence before the storm. It was noise without enough recognition. In the end, Pearl Harbor became a story not only of attack, but of transmission. Messages sent, reports received, assumptions made, and meanings lost. It is a story of new technologies, such as radar, arriving before the procedures around them had matured. It is a story of old fears, such as sabotage, shaping preparations for the wrong kind of danger. It is a story of intelligence that could show a diplomatic break without showing the flight path of the planes already in the air.
The final hours before Pearl Harbor do not offer the comfort of a single missed message that, if handled differently, would neatly explain everything. They show something more troubling and more enduring. Institutions can possess pieces of warning and still fail to act in time. Commanders can be alert to danger and still be alert to the wrong form of it. A signal can be accurate and still be neutralized by a plausible explanation. By the time the attack ended, the harbor had changed. The United States had been pulled fully into war. The names of Oahu's airfields, the ships along Battleship Row, the radar station at Opana, the information center at Fort Shafter, and the destroyer Ward had all become part of a record that investigators, historians, and witnesses would revisit for decades. The question of surprise remained. Not because there had been no warnings, but because there had been warnings that did not become timely action. That is the quiet lesson inside the wreckage. The last day before Pearl Harbor was not empty. It was filled with signals. The tragedy was that they arrived separately, were judged separately, and failed together.